Well-known historian Professor Geoffrey Blainey has in this weekend's Australian set the record straight on some of the factual errors that underpin the narrative in support of the Yes campaign to change Australia's constitution. He said in this weekend's Australian, quote, "The Uluru Statement from the Heart is a vulnerable document. It is sometimes silent when Aboriginal failures are visible, but vocal in condemning Australian people for misdeeds that never happened. Without doubt, the Indigenous people have had many legitimate grievances about their sufferings and slights ever since British convicts and Marines arrived in 1788. Hosts of Aboriginal people were killed in frontier conflict, though the historians' statistics of death tend to contradict each other. Most Indigenous people died from diseases for which they had no immunity, and such deaths far exceeded those suffered in warfare since 1788, close quote. That's a pretty important point in a public narrative that presently suggests there was nothing short of a genocide of Indigenous Australians perpetrated by the British, and that it is that very genocide that has led to intergenerational powerlessness. Now let's be frank here. The overwhelming cause of Aboriginal death in the period following the arrival of the First Fleet was disease, both of the infectious kind and of the lifestyle kind. There has not been anything resembling genocide, defined as, quote, the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. It's not something to be bandied about. Many people died, yes, but it was not a deliberate and systemic killing of Indigenous Australians with the aim of extermination. Not even close. Professor Blainey makes another good point about the modern way that there is talk about the dispossession of land. He says, quote, the loss of their lands, their dispossession, of course created resentment, but Aboriginal leaders tend to think they were the world's only such sufferers. In fact, the ancestors of most mainstream Australians painfully lost their lands in some faraway era and received no compensation, close quote. In this passage, I think we come to a really important point at the heart of the disconnect between the real and tangible goodwill Australians have for Aboriginal people and the low public support that exists for the campaigns for a constitutional voice and a treaty. Australians are a mixed bunch. There are the Aboriginal dispossessed people. There are the British people bundled onto ships against their will for crimes that would carry little consequence today, and told that they would be starting from scratch half a world away from everything they'd ever known. There are the Vietnamese, the Jewish, the Sudanese, and so many more who have been dispossessed by tyrannical governments or conflict without compensation and fleeing for their very lives and freedom. Many families ended up in Australia after being dislocated by 2 world wars in Europe. Mine is no exception. Speaking no English, those on my mother's side were told to flip a coin to decide between South Africa and Australia. I'm so glad the coin landed heads up. And even the Brits have been dispossessed. The 1066 Norman conquest of England saw mass killing and enslavement in far greater numbers than experienced by the Australian Aboriginal people. All of these things happened to near all of our ancestors in one place or another. It's the ugly truth of most of human history worldwide. But these hardships haven't been experienced by many of us in the present, save perhaps for recent migrants. So we have a choice in the now, in every day, about whether we let past wrongs hold us back or whether we look to the future with an optimism born from a really important truth. And that truth is that in this country, anyone, literally anyone, who is prepared to work hard, learn, stay out of trouble and look after their bodies and their families can live a life in which they will finish in a better place than where they started. In this country, there really is education and economic opportunity available to anyone who wants it, and to social mobility unequalled in the world. And to the credit of those who led the colony, slavery has never been a part of Australia's history. The Christian influence, particularly from William Wilberforce, was powerful in the minds of settlers who didn't always get it right, but rarely acted with ill intent. Now, none of this is to say that our history is perfect. There were killings, and there were individuals who did treat Indigenous Australians appallingly. That was never okay, and it isn't now. But people like Minister Linda Burney do themselves no favours when they try and rewrite history. Blainey observes, quote, "Linda Burney has mistakenly insisted that as a young girl she was never in a census. She said the notion that you weren't worthy of being counted was very painful," she exclaimed in 2017. She once misinformed Parliament that until the age of 10 she was not even a citizen. Instead, she claimed she was merely ranked under the Flora and Fauna Act of New South Wales. Such a policy did not exist. It's an important point, Professor Blainey points out there. It's also important that, as we go into a campaign for a referendum to insert an Indigenous voice into the Constitution, that we get the facts straight. It would be wrong to abuse Australians' genuine care for Aboriginal people by basing it on lies or half-truths. So let's correct a few. The first census to be conducted by Commonwealth officers was in 1911, and the Federal Attorney-General instructed them to count, quote, full-blood Aboriginals. Not the best language, sure, but from at least then there can be no doubt that Aboriginal people were being counted. But as Professor Blainey shows, there are records showing that Aboriginal people were being counted even as early as 1871. The descriptions might offend our modern manners, but the notion that Aboriginal people were not being acknowledged and counted and treated as people is just plain false. In the late 1850s, the three populous Australian colonies, they were Victoria, South Australia and New South Wales. In those, most Aboriginal men were allowed to vote. Ponder that for a moment. Think about its significance in context. At that time, most of Europe's tens of millions of men did not have a right to vote. And yet, in 1889, the rural seat of Young in New South Wales was won by a man of Aboriginal and convict background. It's a pretty cool thing. In the 1896 South Australian election, Aboriginal women had the right to vote and did. Think about this. At that time, 99% of the women in the world didn't have a vote, but Aboriginal women in South Australia did. As Professor Blainey put it, quote, "In renowned cities such as Paris, Berlin, London, New York, St. Petersburg, Tokyo and Beijing, not one woman had the privilege now exercised by female Aboriginal voters in South Australia." But 5 years later, in the first federal election, various Aboriginal women must have voted, an election in which no white woman in the 4 eastern states was yet entitled to vote. The cry of powerlessness from Australian Aboriginal lobbyists pulls at the heartstrings. And no doubt there are some people from all walks of life that feel powerless from time to time. But in this country, where Aboriginal people have been both counted and voting for a very long time, where 55% of the Australian land mass has been peacefully transferred in actual or practical terms to the traditional owners, where we have never spent more than we do right now to provide services to the most disadvantaged, well, our first Australians are far from uncounted, far from unheard, and far from powerless. It'd be a pity if a failure of Australians, even parliamentarians, to know their history was used to permanently divide our citizens into different categories with different rights based only on the basis of their race. Conferring a privilege on the basis of race in the present doesn't remedy a past wrong. It merely perpetrates a new wrong in the present and into the future. So let's keep Australia a land where there truly is equality of opportunity for anyone prepared to give life the best possible go.